The world has a new pope. White smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, signaling a new pope has been elected to lead the Catholic Church to the erupting cheers of the crowd in St. Peter's Square. Cardinal Robert Prevost secured 89 votes needed out of 133 cardinals participating in the conclave to be elected as successor to Pope Francis. He is the first American pope in history. Joining me now is the Hill's Sarakshi Rai with more on what we know about the new pope. All right, Sarakshi, so church bells rang out across the world to mark this moment in history. What do we know about Prevost and the roles he has served in the Catholic Church?
That's right. We have a new pope, Drew. Robert Francis Prevost was elected the 267th pope of the Roman Catholic Church today. He took the name Pope Leo, becoming really the first pope from the United States and emerging really as a dark horse in this race where he wasn't even considered to be a major contender. You know, most people thought that any American to be the next pope would really be a long shot. But, you know, when we saw that puff of white smoke from the chimney above the Sistine Chapel, you know, that really signaled that the cardinals that had been really sequestered inside for 2 days had elected a new leader, you know, for the world's 1.4 billion Roman Catholic. Now, you know, as Pope, Leo will have to confront some very difficult decisions about the church's direction, and mainly whether or not to continue the agenda of his predecessor, Pope Francis, who was a champion for greater inclusion and openness to change until his death last month, you know, and he has to decide whether he's going to forge a different path. Now, you know, Pope Leo is 69 years old. He is Chicago born, and he served for 2 decades in Peru, where he became a bishop and a naturalized citizen of Peru. You know, he really then rose to lead his international religious order until the death of Pope Francis, and he held one of the most influential Vatican posts running the office that selects and manages the bishops globally. So, you know, a huge role really that Pope Francis kind of brought him in to lead.
What do you make of the significance of having an American pope? Obviously the first time in history. What do you think that means for the church and kind of its perception around the world?
I mean, this really threw Americans for a loop. You know, this is the first time we have an American pope, and the first words from the new pope, which, you know, were closely watched by those all around the world, Catholics and non-Catholics alike. And those words were, "Peace be with you all." He appeared visibly emotional while he addressed, you know, the square and the world as he made his first appearance as pope. He paid tribute to his predecessor, Pope Francis, and he spoke in Italian. And, you know, from his speech, at least, it seems that he is going to continue Pope Francis' direction of the church towards inclusion. You know, he said, "Let us keep in our ears the weak voice of Pope Francis that blesses Rome. The Pope who blessed Rome gave his blessing to the entire world that morning of Easter. Allow me to follow up on that blessing. God loves us. God loves everyone. Evil will not prevail." You know, so those were some of his first words. And you know, one criticism, though, is that we do know that his period as Archbishop in Peru was also clouded by allegations of covering up sexual abuse claims, which were denied, you know, so that's something that will probably come up as well. We also know that he has been critical, at least in some of his social media posts, of some of the direction that President Trump and the administration have taken regarding immigrants and illegal migrants in the country. We know that he's also retweeted some tweets that are critical of Vice President J.D. Vance. And, you know, people are still combing through his social media right now to try and figure out where exactly he stands on a lot of issues.
Yeah, you know, Pope Francis was arguably the most liberal pope of the modern era. Does this mark a shift? And what does it mean, do you think, for the direction of the church under this new pope?
You know, Pope Francis very clearly had his eye on Pope Leo and in many ways saw him as his heir apparent, even though he was a dark horse in this race, right? No one thought an American would be the next pope, but he really brought in Prevost to the Vatican in 2023 to serve as the powerful head of the office that vets bishop nominations around the world. Now, this is one of the most important jobs in the Catholic Church. And in January this year, he elevated him to the senior ranks of cardinals. You know, so, you know, this is also kind of just pointing to the fact that he had a prominence going into this conclave that few other cardinals had. You know, we also know that, you know, his views are going to be watched. What he says is going to be closely watched around the world. And interestingly, He didn't post a single time on X in 2024, but in 2025 he posted 5 times. And of those 5 times, in the first one he criticized J.D. Vance's take on Jesus. In his second post, he posted an article critiquing Vance's statements on deportation policies. He then retweeted about the Pope's health twice, and then he retweeted criticism of Trump and El Salvadorian President Bukele's laughter at Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Maryland man who is, been kind of deported to El Salvador, and something that the Trump administration has been dealing with for the past few weeks.
Yeah, very interesting. They're not shy, it seems, to weigh into hot-button issues. Walk us through the election process. Many were expecting a longer conclave. What does the length of the vote tell us? Does it mean widespread support?
That's right. I mean, this essentially was a 2-day voting block, right? The voting followed a very strict choreography that is dictated by church law. Now, I was unaware of this, but I recently watched Conclave, the movie, and so have some understanding of the process as well. Each cardinal writes his choice on a piece of paper inscribed with the words in Latin, and hopefully I'm not butchering it. It's Eligo in Summum Pontificem, which means essentially, I elect as Supreme Pontiff. Then they approach the altar one by one and say, I call as witness Christ the Lord, who will be my judge, that my vote is given to the one who before God I think should be elected. So it's a deeply moving and meaningful process, right? This folded ballot is then placed on a round plate and tipped into a gold and silver urn. And once cast, these ballots are opened one by 3 different scrutineers who are essentially cardinals elected at random to write down names and read them aloud. So it's a very moving process, and then they kind of tally up the votes. It's very symbolic. This is a process that has been, since the dawn of the Catholic Church, been followed, and their work is then checked by other cardinals as well, and the results of each round of balloting is then kind of written down on a separate piece of paper and preserved in the papal archives. And we then find out, they then work the ballot through with a needle, and the words Eligo is kind of written through it, and the ballots are then bound together with thread. And if at the end of each vote, all of the ballots are bundled up together and then put aside and then burned in the chapel stove, which then results in either black smoke or white smoke. And we saw, after 4 rounds of voting, that Pope Leo was elected in one of the shortest elections in history. Pope Francis, for his election as Pope, went through 5 ballots, and we saw that white smoke today from the Sistine Chapel, Drew.
Here we sit in 2025. How much power do you think the Pope actually has on the global stage?
We've really seen Pope Francis, take the lead on being very vocal on global issues since his election as Pope 12 years ago. We saw him really speak up and speak his mind on a lot of issues, even if it went against some of the world leaders and their policies. So, we've seen that the Pope is extremely influential. He does have sway. I mean, he is the head of the church of millions of people. But, it is important to note that given that we have the first American Pope, there has been a taboo usually against a U.S. Pope, given, the geopolitical power that the U.S. already wields, right? And so the papacy essentially has been bouncing among different continents, and it hasn't really been, we haven't seen an Italian Pope for almost 50 years now. We've had Poland, Germany, Argentina, and now the United States. So, essentially the United States is going to be wielding a huge influence on the global stage. We know already how much influence the U.S. wields. We know how important President Trump is and how his election was closely watched. And now, the Pope is really giving the U.S. added influence as well on the global stage.
All right, guess I'm going to have to go watch Conclave now. I'm sure they're getting a massive streaming bump over the last several days. Sarakshi Rai, thanks so much for your time.